Welcome to Pre-Shift, tidbits of wisdom for everyday service. My name is TJ Griffin, and I'm the corporate wine educator for Winebow. We welcome your questions at any point during the webinar, but please use the Q&A rather than the chat bar to submit them. Let me introduce your host. Master Sommelier Ron Edwards is the husband of one wife, the father of 5 girls, a surfer, missionary kid, and a lover of all things bow tie. He has over 29 years of hospitality experience, and since 2018, he has been the director of wine education for Winebow. And now, here to discuss today's topic, Building a Wine Program, Part 1, Master Sommelier Ron Edwards.
Well, hello, TJ. Thank you for the kind introduction. I have one more thing to add, just one new thing, because people keep hearing the same things. If you're going to buy me a cup of coffee, please make it an espresso straight. Thank you very much. Something new. We'll have to change that introduction up a little bit. Welcome to everyone out there who's joined us at this moment. And if you want to share this with friends, it will end up on Winebow's YouTube channel. Look for the Pre-Shift playlist inside of there. And all of the episodes leading up to this are there. And obviously, if this is episode 1 of Building a Wine Program, it's going to be relevant that you might want to revisit it or pass it along to other people as we get to 2 and 3, and very likely 4. This is probably a 4-part series. Even though I would not go down the path of saying I'm trying to consult from you from a distance the way I used to before I came to Winebow, this is a very complicated subject matter, and the idea is to sort of point people in the right direction. Okay, TJ? So, the idea here is to sort of get us set up for success. The idea is, if you're going to put together a great wine program, we got to start thinking about the most important factors. And it is a crucial part of the experiential and financial success of any hospitality business is the beverage program as a whole. And certainly in today's increased awareness over the last decade and a half of Americans and wine, this is absolutely so important to the final experiences. What did they get out of your wine program? It's very important to walk into this open eyes, though, right? And that is that, wine has a higher cost of goods sold than spirits on average. But the balancing act there is it has a larger potential dollars per sale. So what I mean by that is you might still sell somebody a $15 specialty cocktail, but that's not the same as a $150 bottle of wine as far as dollars in the bank. It's a great percentage of margin right off the bat, but it doesn't have the same all right, we pay our bills on dollars in the bank, not percentage of cost, although they both have to be in balance to make the program work right. So let's keep that in mind, is that, all of these things are going to be about figuring out how to balance out all the parts and pieces that make a great hospitality experience great. The food, the bar program, the beer program, the coffee program, the wine program, everything has to be kept in one box, right? And they all have to fit together in that puzzle. So let's move into some essentials, the things that we have to think of. So it's first things first, TJ. The idea of, what do I have to do before I do anything else to build a great wine program? And, the first thing is you got to reflect the business strategy. And if you're part of the ownership that has come to this idea that to take on this project, then please do yourself a favor and start with a solid strategy that involves short-term, long-term goals. It involves all the details that make a business possible and successful. And don't do this on the back of a napkin at a cocktail bar. Really put some time and effort into this, especially if you're an independent operator. I mean, 1 out of every 10 independent restaurants in a normal scenario of life make it past year 3. And of those, only one of the 10 that survive, only one of those survives past 5 years. So that strategy is super important, and it's so relevant to getting the most out of your restaurant or hospitality program. That is dollars. It's really there to make sense with the concept. So things you have to figure out right off the bat. You got to know in your heart that you are living inside the business strategy, that you are balancing what the client desires with the business goals. You need to make sense with the concept. So however you put your beverage program together, it needs to make sense with the concept. Like, to me, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to have an Asian cuisine focused restaurant that's really heavy on New World Cabernet Sauvignon. Okay, well, that might be the client desire, but it doesn't make any sense with the food. Vice versa would be an all-American wine list in an Italian restaurant. That doesn't make any sense either, right? So simple things, those are easy to figure out, but it gets a little muddy with other concepts, right? So the creativity level of your wine list. And so your wine program, I hate to use the word esoteric because esoteric is very relative, right? What I think is weird is not necessarily going to be what Jim down the street thinks is weird, or what I think is really off the beaten path is not going to be the same to the person who lives in Brooklyn, for instance. So I'm just going to use the word creativity. The creativity needs to fit your audience, and even more importantly, it has to fit your staffing model and training regimen. You cannot write an adventurous, odd, off the beaten path, complex wine program if you are not willing to train your staff all the time, every day, because the people you're bringing in that have to sell this, even if you're the sommelier working the floor, you're only one person. You want all of your staff selling this wine program. They need to be just as up to date as you are. The size of your wine program has to fit the business model and the physical space. Where are you going to store all the wine? How much cash flow are you going to have to keep your stock up to date? So, for instance, some of us live in states where you can actually order one bottle of something from your distributor as long as you fill the minimum case for the whole order, right? And other people live in states where you have to order a case of a wine to order any of it. Well, if I'm going to have a 200 item wine list in a state that only allows me to order by the case, then I have to have enough storage for 200 cases of wine at a time. That boggles my mind. I've never worked in that scenario. I know that it exists in some places, but the biggest problem in restaurants especially is balancing the cash flow needs. I have to write a check for that wine when I order it in most states. Some states are 60 days or 30 days. And so I have to make sure I have enough money in the account to support the wine program I've written, support the beverage program. Beyond that, pay salaries, buy food, take care of marketing. So it's definitely in such a cash flow heavy business, you definitely need to make sure that you're balancing that out. And then what kind of accessories am I going to have to add to this restaurant space to make this wine program work? What kind of glassware do I have to invest in? Do I need decanters or not? We know from my last discussion, I think decanters belong everywhere. Ice buckets or just chillers? Coasters? Or are we just going to use B&B plates? Do I need to purchase some sort of storage for the wine? Most likely you do, and that's a whole nother conversation as it goes.
So the first things first is not call up all your favorite reps and taste a bunch of wines.
No, that's a good way to get in a lot of trouble, and I'm glad you brought it up because I have done it that way, which is why I'm so adamant about this slide, is that I've done it the opposite, where I've written the whole program and then realized I can't do that here, or I tried to force a round, square peg into a round hole concept, and went that direction. So I'll tell a story on myself. I got this great consulting gig in 2005 to launch my consulting business. And I didn't know enough about what I was trying to do to really ask the right questions. And I went into this client, and it could have been a lot better experience for the client and myself if I had just put first things first when I started working on their wine program, because I was too myopic. I didn't interview the client well enough to find out all the other things that were going to have to interact with whatever I did for them. And because of that, it wasn't a failure, but it was a little more clunky than it should have been. And I certainly wasn't as good a consultant for them as I would have been if I had asked it a lot of those questions up front. So I'm glad you asked that. And certainly any of you out there who are new to the business and you're that person that ownership looks to or general manager looks to and goes, yeah, you can write the wine list, which I always am amazed that people think writing a wine program is just a piece of cake and that anyone with a brain can do it. And there's technique and there's stuff here. And so I'm going to help you be successful your first time more so than I was my first time. So the first thing we have to put together is financial success has to come first. This is a business. As much as we love to take care of people and make them happy and give them pleasure in our dining rooms, it's a business first. Because if we don't take care of the business, there'll be no dining room for them to have fun in, and we won't get that satisfaction that we love so much. So we need to get our stakeholders together, the investors, the general manager, the corporation, whoever it is that you have to talk to. And we have to start right at the beginning after we figured out the stuff like, all right, what's this concept? What's going to fit here ideologically and all that stuff. Now we got to talk money. What's going to be the target? Are we going to go down this sort of, there was a movement for a while, and you can still dabble with this, that dollars in the bank was more important than cost of goods sold. Hospitality industry works on cost of goods sold. Retail and wholesale works on margin. They're just the opposite of each other. Margin is the profit left over. Cost of goods sold is what it cost you to sell what you sold. And by the way, if you don't know how to calculate that and you work in this industry, please figure that out. You can email me afterwards. I'll be happy to give you the simple formula, but too many people who are buying wine are handed a spreadsheet that has everything figured out for them, and they don't actually understand how to figure out their cost percentages. So that's important. Are we really going to focus on dollars in the bank, or at the end of the month when I turn in my inventory, are you really going to be upset with me because I didn't meet this percentage number on the sheet? That's very, very important. There is a difference there because you can run a higher cost of goods percentage in some programs if you're concentrating on dollars in the bank, and that's mainly because you're selling a lot of high-priced wine. If you're in a casual concept selling, the average bottle going out the door is $30 to $40, and the glass pour that you're serving is, $8 to $10, then you're going to have to worry about percentages because you're not putting enough dollars in the bank to ignore smart cost percentages. And then last is like the idea of what am I going to do? What's my cost of goods on a bottle versus my cost of goods by the glass? And, one of my good friends and I had a conversation today to make sure I was remembering all the right things, since I haven't done this in just a smidge, and he has just moved out of that realm. And we were talking about sliding scale, which is what I want to bring up here, is that some business models, they just hand it over and say everything in this business has to be marked up by multiply by 4 for glass pour, multiply by 3 for bottles. And it makes it very predictable, but it doesn't make it very kind to the customer who's might want an upper tier bottle of wine and now is paying 3 times cost on it. Whereas I and my friend, we always used a sliding scale where you took ranges of costs and you shot for a target cost of goods sold. Mine was always 36. He had several different businesses that he was involved in, and some were lower than that, some were a little higher than that, depending on how fine dining they were. And you would look at what you're selling the most of and make sure that your sliding scale balanced out to where you wanted it to be. Sort of, here's my end goal. Now I'm going to work backwards with my math to get there. And if you have a really strong buy the glass program, you can make up for a lot of quote unquote cost of goods sins in your bottle program because your buy the glass program is driving your cost down. All right. That was a lot.
Yes. That's a lot. It seems like there's some math in there.
Yeah, there's definitely some math. I recommend learning spreadsheets, at least enough to do if-then statements so that you can figure out your sliding scale costs. And if you don't want to do it that way, you just make sure that you understand how to transfer formulas and stuff like that. A basics, even LinkedIn has good content on Excel or basic spreadsheet manipulation. It's an essential in the world of a beverage manager. Beverage managers need to be business people first and artisans second. And that is coming from someone who got his professional certification in more of the artisan concept, but you have to be a good business person. Otherwise there's no business to run. So there are these 4 things that come into play here in every restaurant. that I've got on this screen, and you have to have them in a cohesive bond with each other, where your beer program, your cocktail or spirits program, your wine program, and also the culinary program are all going to work together to get you to the end of my restaurant's either profitable or not. In each of these various genres, the food cost varies depending on what you're primarily selling. Your wine costs will vary. Your spirits and beer and all that is there's ranges of this stuff, right? It's not like one thing is absolutely right, which is why we have to talk upfront with our key stakeholders that are holding us accountable as beverage managers to a number, whatever that number is. All right, so let's talk about food costs for a second, because everybody's going to order food at a restaurant. That's the whole point. And so chefs need to be very aware of food cost, and you as the beverage manager do need to be aware of that as well. And so target cost of goods sold, when I was working for restaurants, all of mine was a mixed cost of good of like 21%, because I never worked for one of the specialty restaurants where it was like all beef, which is going to be a much more expensive thing. It was like mixing in a very peasant oriented dish with cheap ingredients with halibut on the other side of the menu. And in the end, menu mix gets you to a point that 21% was the goal. And that's what the kitchen managers, sous chefs, et cetera, were expected to meet. If you work in one of our, elite steakhouses, you're going to be running a food cost that's more like 40% for a great steak, but your steak is $60. So we get into that dollars in the bank thing, right? So even if I meet 21% cost of goods on a $25 entree, or main course, I should say, I still haven't put as much money in the bank for that person sitting at the table as I did for the $65 steak at 40% cost. So keep that in mind, because it plays into wine as well. And these are all conversations you have to have as business people together running each section of the department. But what you will see very often is in the higher cost item focused restaurants like steakhouses, you'll see that their wine markup is larger. Like everything's multiplied by 3 or more. Whereas in a casual bistro where you can get the 21% cost of goods, you are less aggressive with your pricing. And so as the customer spends up on your wine menu, they have a lower markup. So you might get as far as, 40-45% cost of goods sold on the bottle of wine, because you're making a conscious decision to give them a reason to put dollars in the bank instead of supporting your percentage. Is all this making sense so far, TJ?
There's a lot to follow, but it makes sense. But I never really thought about the wine program or the beverage program having to make up for food costs. I always thought of like back of the house and front of the house, like I'll do my program and you do your program. But you're absolutely right, especially with steakhouses, and it will vary, which is a conversation you need to have before you start.
Yeah, and in some ways, you're not really making. I don't know if Rick and I, that was my friend that I was talking to, we were kind of going round and round about that. And he goes, I'm not sure you're actually making up for their cost of goods sold, but nonetheless, you see it put into practice as if it's making up for cost of goods sold on high dollar food items. So I kind of feel like that business model for that style of restaurant is depending on overall profitability, which is a percentage as well as a number, right? Is leaning on the beverage program to be more profitable, because percentage wise, they're less profitable out of the kitchen. But that's also why you see the 6-pound baked potato and the cream spinach on the side and all that stuff, because that's low cost item that they're charging you for to make up for the steak. So it's all just part of the game, right? But you can't guarantee that everybody will order a bunch of sides. So you're playing the averages. Okay, so let's talk spirits for a second. Your bar spirits program in fine dining is probably targeting that 19%, 20% overall cost of goods. That's mixing in all of your wells and your just well drinks. I'll have a gin and tonic alongside of your custom cocktails and all that stuff. But if you're in a volume bar situation where the spirits you're pouring in the well are not very expensive, let's just use that term, you might be less than 15% on your overall bar cost, which is, it's hard to, when you start looking at cost of goods sold, wine's not very attractive compared to those numbers. So we will often see in a volume bar where people the wine choices are not what you might choose otherwise, because they're looking at it from a different perspective than a fine dining restaurant, right? So keep that in mind. If you're running one of these volume places, just embrace the fact that you're making a great percentage on spirits, and understand that you're probably not, well, you just shouldn't make that kind of percentage on wine, because wine is a more exposed market these days. Your beer target, if you're running most regular restaurants, beer target's probably around 25%, maybe as much as 30 if you're running like a real localized craft beer program with a lot of and then if you're on the other end and you have a lot of draft beer where you can make a better margin, make a better cost of goods sold, especially if you're selling a lot of domestic light beer to simple lagers, or the big names that come along with that, you might be 16 to 21% cost of goods. So your wine program, now when you look at all these numbers, it's going to range, in that casual bistro where you're doing a lot of wines by the glass, and your average bottle out the door is fairly low cost, meaning under $50, maybe even under 40, maybe under 35 in some places. 30% is something you're really looking at there. You're trying to hit that low 30s because you're not putting a lot of dollars in the bank per transaction, right? It's like, why is a coffee shop so hard to stay open? Well, because coffee doesn't bring no matter what percentage you sell it at, it doesn't put a ton of money in the bank per customer. So that's same thing with wine. Now, in a fine dining setting where your average bottle price is exceeding that $50 mark, maybe even in a super fine dining, it's exceeding $100 a mark, you're going to have a different cost of goods sold percentage because you're putting more dollars in the bank per transaction. So, in my fine dining experience, I was targeting 36% overall cost of goods on wine. That included glass pours mixed in together. And I have discussed with some folks who were in situations where their average bottle cost was pretty high to go as high as 38. I've never run across one that admitted that they were satisfied with 40%. It could exist, but it would be one of those things where the ownership is saying to the customer,